There's a specific type of person who knows exactly why they do what they do, can trace their patterns back to childhood, explain their defense mechanisms in clinical terms, and still, reliably, predictably, does the exact same thing they've always done. They're not confused. They're not in denial. They understand themselves completely. And that understanding is precisely what keeps everything the same. Most people assume insight and change exist on the same spectrum, that if you understand why you avoid intimacy, you'll stop avoiding it. If you can articulate your fear of failure, you'll eventually act differently. But psychology recognizes a less comfortable truth. Understanding your behavior and changing your behavior are separate processes, operating in different systems, and one can function perfectly well without the other. Sometimes, one exists specifically to prevent the other. When you think about a problem, you're using your cognitive system. When you act on a problem, you're using your behavioral system. These systems are not the same mechanism. They don't operate by the same rules. Your cognitive system handles information. It processes nuance, constructs explanations, runs on language and abstraction. That's where insight lives. Your behavioral system handles action. It runs on reinforcement, repetition, environmental cues. It doesn't care what you understand. It cares what gets rewarded. A smoker doesn't quit because they understand addiction. They quit when smoking stops being rewarded, or when an alternative behavior gets reinforced more strongly. The understanding can exist for decades without touching the behavior. Research on habit formation confirms this. Behavior change requires altering the actual reinforcement structure, not the narrative about it. This creates a specific psychological situation. You can become extremely sophisticated at the cognitive level while remaining completely unchanged at the behavioral level. And for many people, that sophistication isn't preparation for change. It's a replacement for it. Every behavior has a function. If a pattern repeats, something is being maintained by it. Usually it's the avoidance of a specific type of discomfort, but insight itself can serve the same function. Understanding why you do something reduces the anxiety of not knowing why you do something. That reduction is a reward, and like any reward, it reinforces the behavior that led to it. When you finally identify the origin of a pattern, there's relief. The confusion resolves. The chaos gets organized into a coherent story. That story feels like progress. And psychologically, that feeling is often sufficient. This is why insight can become its own endpoint. You weren't trying to change the behavior. You were trying to reduce the discomfort of not understanding it. Once you understand it, the system stabilizes. The anxiety drops. The urgency dissipates. You've solved the problem your brain was actually trying to solve, which was never the behavior itself. It was the cognitive dissonance around it. Psychology calls this intellectualization when it functions as a defense mechanism. You convert emotional conflict into abstract analysis. The analysis feels productive, but it never crosses the threshold into action because it was never designed to. It exists to manage the feeling, not alter the pattern. Self-awareness also operates as a decision delay mechanism. Change creates uncertainty. Even when the current pattern is painful, it's predictable. Changing means dismantling that infrastructure without knowing what replaces it. For most nervous systems, that's a threat. If you're in the process of understanding, you have a legitimate reason to delay. You're not avoiding the decision, you're being thorough. This sounds reasonable. It is reasonable, and it can continue indefinitely. Research on self-regulation shows that people often mistake preparatory behavior for goal-directed behavior. Thinking about going to the gym activates similar neural pathways as actually going, but it doesn't produce the same outcome. The same applies to insight. Thinking about why you do something activates the feeling of addressing it without requiring you to confront the actual consequences of changing it. Analysis is a stable state. It doesn't force a decision. It doesn't expose you to the vulnerability of trying something new and failing. It lets you remain the person who understands their problems, which is a much less threatening identity than the person who tried to change and couldn't. Here's the reframe that matters. When insight doesn't lead to change, it's not malfunctioning. It's functioning perfectly, just not at the level most people think. You assume the function of insight is behavioral correction. That understanding is meant to generate action. But that's only one possible function, and often it's not the active one. The actual function, the one the system is executing, is threat reduction. Insight reduces the threat of confusion. It reduces the threat of uncertainty. It reduces the social threat of appearing unconscious or defensive. It stabilizes identity. It provides narrative coherence. All of that is functional. All of that gets rewarded internally and externally. So when you say, "I understand why I do this, but I keep doing it," you're describing success, not failure. The system succeeded at delivering insight. It just never prioritized behavior change because behavior change was never the variable under threat. The threat was not knowing, and that threat has been eliminated. This is why people can spend years in therapy, journaling, or self-reflection and remain behaviorally identical. They're measuring success by the wrong outcome. The system isn't trying to change behavior, it's trying to reduce discomfort, and insight does that more efficiently with less risk than action ever could. Some of the most behaviorally unchanged people are also the most psychologically articulate. They can explain their attachment style, their trauma responses, their cognitive distortions. They use the right terms. They've read the books. And none of that touches what they do. This isn't a failure of intelligence. It's a demonstration of how completely you can understand a system without altering it. In fact, the ability to articulate often becomes part of the pattern's defense structure. If you can explain why you do something, people stop questioning it. If you can demonstrate self-awareness, it signals that you're working on it, even if you're not. The articulation creates social permission to continue the behavior. It reframes the pattern from something that needs to change to something I'm conscious of. And consciousness, culturally, gets treated as if it's halfway to resolution. It's not. A map is not the territory. You can know exactly why you avoid conflict and still avoid conflict every single time it appears. The knowledge and the action are simply not connected. At a certain point, insight stops being a tool and becomes the loop itself. You have a pattern. The pattern creates discomfort. The discomfort triggers analysis. The analysis produces insight. The insight relieves the discomfort. The relief reinforces the analysis. The pattern continues. Now, the pattern isn't just the original behavior. It's the behavior plus the recursive self-examination. You're not just someone who avoids commitment. You're someone who avoids commitment and spends significant time understanding why. The understanding becomes part of the identity, and identities are self-maintaining. The system is coherent. It has internal logic. Every component reinforces every other component. There's no external pressure to disrupt it, because from the inside it feels like progress. You're aware. You're engaged. That engagement registers as meaningful activity, even when nothing outside your thought patterns shifts. For many people, staying the same is more valuable than changing. Not because they're lazy, not because they're broken, but because their current pattern, even if it's limiting, serves a function that changing would eliminate, and that function is identity stability. You know who you are when you operate within your pattern. You know how people respond to you. You know what to expect from yourself. That knowledge is organizing. It reduces ambiguity. And human nervous systems prioritize predictability over improvement when the two conflict. If you've spent years being the person who self-sabotages, or withdraws, or overanalyzes, that's not just a behavior. That's a role. Changing the behavior means changing the role. And changing the role means entering a period of uncertainty where you don't know who you are or how you'll be received. Most people don't choose that consciously. They just find themselves, year after year, understanding more and doing the same. And the understanding makes it feel like they're moving. But nothing in the external structure shifts. Self-awareness without behavioral change isn't a failure. It's a feature. The system is working exactly as designed. The design just isn't what most people think it is. If you've ever wondered why you can explain your patterns so clearly and still repeat them so precisely, this is the mechanism. Understanding doesn't disrupt behavior. It manages the discomfort of behavior. And for most people, that's sufficient. You're not stuck because you don't understand. You understand completely. The understanding is what allows you to stay exactly where you are without the cognitive dissonance that would otherwise force a decision. You've built a framework that makes sense of the pattern, and the framework is stable. More stable than the vulnerability of changing. More predictable than the risk of becoming someone you can't anticipate. The pattern continues. The insight continues. They coexist indefinitely, without conflict. Not because something is broken, because the system has reached equilibrium, and equilibrium, by definition, resists displacement.
Pattern forensics. We don't fix behavior. We identify the system that keeps it intact.